Hello and welcome to this video on the Future Sound System's OSC2 Recombination Engine. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. Right at the start, for clarity, I'd like to thank Future Sound Systems for sponsoring this video. A note on that in the description. Now, the Recombination Engine is a triple oscillator with a new and unique way of forming harmonics and waveforms. We have a master oscillator, the Scissor, on the left, and then both positive and negative DNAs, which are kind of slave oscillators, and then a glue section, which is a VCA and mix input. The Scissor has coarse and fine tuning, pulse width modulation with an attenuator, and then two frequency modulation inputs A and B, which can be exponential or linear. There's also a switch there to take this from high frequency audio use down into low frequency LFO use. We've got ramp, triangle and square wave outputs, and 3 modulation bus switches, which we'll come to shortly. Now, that Scissor master oscillator switches at audio rates between the positive and negative DNAs. The positive goes from 0 to 5 volts, the negative from 0 to -5 volts. So as they're combined, they create your standard bipolar -5 to +5 waveform. Now, these can be used independently, and they've got sine, triangle and ramp waves on their own, both on the positive and negative side, their own coarse and fine tune, FM with exponential or linear response, frequency input, VCAs over the waveform levels, raw outputs, and a mixed output. The VCAs and the mixing works really nicely in that their levels goes from being off to a fully switched at the rate of the Scissor state at 12, and then to fully droning from 12 up to full. So we get some unique audio rate switched waveforms or just droning waveforms. These are combined in the glue section, where they're merged together to give us this glued waveform. We've got bias and CV and a CV input for the VCA and a mix input too. It's quite simple to actually use, but there's a massive range to this thing. It's unique, tons of sounds. I've been massively impressed with this thing. I just wanted to say that up front. So let's dive in. There's been a timing index on screen. Do skip around. Use this as a reference. Use it as a way to think about synthesis and patch tips and apply these to your systems. Let's get on with the video. Here we're going to explore how the DNA sections work with regards to mixing their waveforms, the internal switching that happens on those waveforms through the VCAs themselves. Now at present I have triangles turned up on the positive and negative VCAs. The green trace there is the positive DNA. This is going from 0 to 5 volts. I can add a little graphic on screen to show this. Think of that central point between green and blue as 0 volts. And then the blue trace, the negative DNA, goes from 0 to -5 volts. And what actually happens is these merge together in this glue section. So if I swap over from the stereo sound, you can see there that these merge to be a single shape. If I start to make some changes just to emphasize this, you can see it's just a single waveform, and this is just pan mono down the center of the mix. If I flip back to these being in stereo and the other oscilloscope view, you can see what was actually going on. The yellow trace on data is the rate of the Scissor, the master oscillator, and I've got that connected to a keyboard so I can change its rate. When we control these waveforms, turning them up from 0, they go from being off to being fully switched at the rate of the Scissor at 12 o'clock. So you can see there, this is the triangle waveform, but it's been switched on and off at the rate of the Scissor. If I bring in the triangle to 12 o'clock on the positive side, this is also switching on and off. And again, let's move to this mono sound source, the glue output, and switch over oscilloscope view to have a look. You can see it creates one uniform wave. But if I start to turn up beyond 12 o'clock, it goes from being full signal and switched, with that switching fading across to a fully droning, fully biased, open sound. If I do that on the positive side, it merges back together, changing the rate of the Scissor. Will of course change that kind of ring mod-like overtone that we get. Now going back stereo, let's explore the switching and the waveforms a little bit further. Let's check out, say, the ramps. Now these are tuned in unison, but I could change the tuning. Let's say change the negative DNA and make that a higher rate. This is now an octave higher than the positive DNA, and again we can bring some of the switching in at the rate of the Scissor. We can of course do all of this under voltage control, and switching at lower rates gives us some interesting waveforms. Again, these combine into a single wave at the glue section. Now we need to split them out in stereo for some interesting headphone effects. So here's a really kind of ripping wave slicing patch where I've just thrown LFOs at absolutely everything. 8 LFOs right into the Recombination Engine. And I'll just let you listen for a second. I'm just going to play around with the tuning of the positive and negative DNA and the VCA bias and CV modulation of the onboard VCA. It's literally coming out into the scope and being recorded afterwards. There's no external processing. So simple random arpeggio, 8 LFOs, and just a really nice ripping, sinking, shifting sound. Now this really lovely sounding waveform is coming from AM synthesis. I want to just break down AM because of lots of ways we can do it. Amplitude modulation synthesis. It's a bit of a favourite of mine, certainly in analogue, because you don't get that inherent pitch drift that you get with frequency modulation, usually in analogue. So the cleanest AM we can get is to take a normal waveform, a bipolar one, say from the Scissor, and I'm taking the triangle output here into the mix-in on the VCA. We could use an external VCA, but there's lots of interesting ways of doing it within the Recombination Engine. So turning the mix up and the VCA bias up. There's my triangle Scissor waveform. You can see uninterrupted, not doing any of the kind of cool stuff the Recombination Engine does. And and by taking a raw DNA output, which is this bottom blue trace, into VCA CV, we can amplitude modulate at audio rates and start to play around with AM synthesis. So turning up the CV depth, which is this sine wave, and dropping the bias, we can hear this nice AM that we're starting to play with. Now, one cool thing we can do, and this starts to play into what the recombination is and how it works, is to come out of a mix out and use the VCAs to get the waveform through. But what happens there is, even when it's droning fully, the DNA is passing through to the glue section. So we've got some outside influence, or rather internal influence, on this triangle wave now. It's not just this mix in. You can see I am getting some signal coming through regardless of patching the triangle in. So we're getting the wave mixing in and amplitude modulating that VCA. And it's a really nice effect, and certainly when we drop the level of the DNA to halfway, so it's been switched on and off by the scissor as well, some really interesting interactions. Let's play around with the tuning while this is going on. Again, really interesting AM there. We could of course AM modulate these VCAs, so we'll hear that before we move on to a nice variety of more musical AM patches. So here's some nice tones just using sine waves, but because the DNA waveforms and how the DNA works, we're switching the waves on and off until their level is full. And I'll show you that without any modulation. We've explained this in the video, but we go from off through to full level, but switching at the rate of the scissor on and off, through to droning through fully. So if we start to modulate that, it's not just going to modulate the level, it's going to modulate through that switching state. So taking the negative DNA sine into the VCA, we're modulating through that switch state as well as modulating on and off. It's a really nice overtone. For two sines, that's super rich. But because both DNAs are switching on and off, you have to balance the tuning of your modulator and the scissor that's turning both negative and positive DNAs off. I really love AM synthesis. I know I bat on about it a little bit in these demos, but it just sounds great. So here's the last patch where we ended the kind of technical demonstration of AM synthesis, but I've chained across a volt per octave sequence across all the oscillators and set up a gate to the envelope modulating the depth of the negative DNA's sine wave, which is this blue trace, and that's what's modulating the positive DNA's sine wave. And as we explained, it's not just modulating amplitude, it's modulating through that VCA state of those waveform controls, where it goes through the switching at the rate of the scissor. Tiny bit of delay in the background, but why not? We've had lots of dry oscillator sounds so far. So here's a nice soft detuned triangle kind of patch. I'm using CV lock again to get that 1 volt per octave input across all three oscillators for switching and the positive and negative DNAs. We can change this very nicely, patch a little bit of feedback AM, amplitude modulation. So I'll take the sine out of the positive DNA into the VCA CV in, turn that up. We can hear it fade in and out, almost like an LFO because of the detune between these oscillators. It adds a lovely throaty kind of overtone. So here's an AM synthesis drone, and a quick tip to actually cancel out this switching of these waveforms is to just move the pulse width up full, because the square wave from the scissor is what's switching these on and off. If it's just a full pulse width, it's just fully open, it's a high voltage that doesn't come back down because the pulse width cancels out. So watch what happens. The scissors square there, controlling the switching, is the yellow trace. The green trace is the positive, the blue trace is the negative, and I'll come to what's going on in a second. But watch what happens when I just turn the pulse width up full. Because the pulse will fully cancel, it means we can completely cancel out the effect of that scissor on the switching of these level controls. Nice tip. So what's happening here is the mix out of the negative DNA, the blue trace there, is modulating the level of the sine wave on the positive DNA. I have 3 unsynced LFOs going to the level of the sine, triangle and ramp on the negative, this kind of constantly shifting tone. Now a couple of nice things we could do here is to get, say, a static wave, say the sine, but then add this modulating, shifting set of waveforms to bring in, say, some harmonics from the ramp. As we bring the pulse width back down on the scissor, so we're fading through these switched states. Really is just a massive sonic playground. So here's a really simple drum patch that simply uses sequencers and envelopes to create all these patterns and information, with every bit of sound from the Recombination Engine not being processed through anything else externally. I'm taking out the triangle from the scissor, triangle from positive, triangle from negative, DNAs, and also the VCA out for 4 parts of a drum kit. Check out what happens when I CV lock all the oscillators. Weird stereo stuff has to happen. More on that in the next patch. So here's turning the Recombination Engine into a more complex drum kit with lots of extra modules, as you can see in this picture. But by using all these extra modules, we've got a really nice drum kit, and something that I'll certainly be sampling out for my own work, and making some beats within the modular as well before I rip this patch down. So here's a really simple patch that doesn't have much to see, but I'm taking the 3 ramps out like a triple oscillator into a mixer and then into a filter. Doing a bit of a preset stacked chord kind of vibe, into some modulated filtering, low pass filtering that is, and some delay and reverb. So here we'll take a look at PWM, and we're going to use this master oscillator, the Scissor, which is what you're looking at on data. Now square wave straight out, we've got manual pulse width control. Which you can see in here will fully cancel out in both directions. Now modulating this very standardly with an LFO sounds great. I'm going to use a cyclical engine in low frequency mode and just take a triangle into PWM, and I'll set that pulse width back in the center. We have an attenuverter for PWM, which sounds great. Let's get a sequence in just to hear this in context. So that's volt per octave into the scissor, and this LFO giving us pulse width modulation. Nice rich analog PWM vibe. What I really want to get into is audio rate PWM, which not only sounds great just on the single scissor oscillator, but cascades across the Recombination Engine really nicely. So let's take this up to audio rates, and we'll use this triangle from the cyclical engine again. Just just fine-tune them into some sort of harmonic relationship. So although it's moving, it's not really kind of dissonantly beating. It gives this really nice kind of aggressive edge to the pulse. You can see all those additional pulses opening up there on the scope. So taking our sound this time from the output VCA, this is the positive and DNA being switched by all of what we could hear before. It's got this glorious kind of bandpass distortion thing going on. It's almost test equipment-like in vibe. This is just sine waves. Let's play around with the tunings. So in this patch, we're going to explore and get our head around the PW skew. So we're just listening to the main output, green trace there on data. I've CV locked it, so this single volt per octave sequence goes right across the whole unit. I've sync locked it, so the positive and negative points sync as this goes positive to negative. When I put PW skew on, notice that it actually changes the frequencies of the oscillators. If there's more negative square wave, more of that lower pulse, it increases that frequency. If there's more of the positive pulse, it increases this frequency. And I'll try and capture some scope shots to show you that. So that's as is. How fast these are moving, we can see they switch. You can see at this point it's faster. We've more of these peaks, a faster positive waveform and a slower negative waveform. As I take the pulse the other way, you can see the other thing happens. It slows down the positive portion of the wave, the positive DNA, and speeds up the negative. So that's the PW skew. Without it, of course, changes when it actually morphs or switches rather between them. We can hear the pitches don't change. With it on, and this works from the bass tuning that these are at. We can of course still freely move the negative DNA, positive DNA, and then PW skew on top. So here we've got some nice vocal, talking oscillator vibe, some sync and some AM. Just another great sound. And that's all of this recombination engine coming into the glue VCA. And I'm using this top sine wave, which is currently synced, to modulate the amplitude. Removing that. This is just the recombination engine. So here's a patch where I wanted to explore the recombination engine as an LFO, because it's one hell of a capable LFO, or free LFOs with the free oscillators. This is a synth voice through multiple effects, then going into a filter bank, then coming back out into more reverb. Now the top output is the triangle from the Scissor. We've then got the main output in green, the glued full kind of main waveform out. And then in pink and yellow, we have positive and negative DNA outputs. I've got all the CV locking and sync locking and PW skew turned off. So these are somewhat independent while still interacting with each other. And I'll just play around. I'll just move coarse tunings first so you get a really obvious idea of what each section of the recombination engine is doing. And And there's an interesting effect and a good way to demo how the VCAs on the positive and negative DNA works. We now have this faster pink trace, which is the negative DNA. And with the triangle up full, it just passes through fully, but this will switch off when that control is at 12 according to the rate of the Scissor, the main oscillator. So notice how we get these bursts that then turn off. So let's make sure none of our waves go above 12. Let's try, say, sine waves. We can see how the positive and negative DNA outputs switch off, and how this is affected and passed through this main output. So here's a patch that's really kind of mad as a box of frogs with the Recombination Engine. And I can't truthfully tell you whether a box of frogs is mad or not, because it depends what mood they're in. But making strange, interesting percussion with the Recombination Engine. I'm not going to break everything down, I'm just going to say that there are some LFOs going in, tons of feedback feeding individual oscillator outs into levels, playing around with the internal AM of that VCA, different tunings, FM, feedback, AM, just really full on. This then goes through a VCA with a random envelope just hitting it. But I'll open it fully and show you this kind of nutty patch that is my unique noise generator patch that I'll probably never recreate with the Recombination Engine. Makes for a little interesting percussive hits when I drop that VCA level. There's weight, rumble, feedback, oddness, and then these different tones and shades of noise. So here we'll look at FM synthesis and work towards this rather gnarly analog FM tone. I'll back off what's going on, and we're listening to the triangle output from the Scissor. That's the green trace there on data. The output of the glue section, the overall merging and uniqueness of this oscillator, or triple oscillator, is going over to the left-hand data just for visual reference for anyone that's curious. The blue trace there is the positive DNA, the yellow trace is the negative DNA, and because we get two FM inputs on the Scissor, I'm going to take raw sine waves out and modulate the Scissor twice. So starting with this sine wave from the positive DNA, we'll go with some linear FM first. It's easy to find these nice kind of harmonic relationships between modulator and carrier. Let's go to exponential FM. Way bigger range as you'd expect from exponential responding FM. So a nice rich kind of throaty FM. Let's add this much faster negative DNA to frequency input B and see what linear and exponential modulation gives us. Remember, this is a negative voltage from the negative DNA, so it's going to be trying to pull the oscillator's pitch down. Let's try exponential. That's nice, they're not quite fully in sync, so we're getting that nice drifting, nice higher pitch overtones and still that throatiness from the positive modulation. You can see the actual glued together waveform on the left-hand data is pretty full on. So I was speaking with Finley from Future Sound Systems on the phone, and he mentioned that with FM and certainly feeding back on itself and frequency modulating, say, the scissor or the positive and negative DNAs separately and from each other, you get these very digital Yamaha DX7 or DX series style FM tones. And I'm simply taking the sine out of the positive DNA to the frequency modulation of the negative DNA and the mix out of the positive DNA back into the scissor. So it's all influencing itself.
Heaving like a rabbit in a wolf's mouth, you play my flute, rockling. Pachavi, save me. Thunder, elephant, moth of everything I sing songs for stables without a place to sit down.
So continuing to explore FM, I think at this point we've stumbled on a nice kind of wavetable-like sound. We're back on this digital FM kind of vibe. There's absolutely nothing digital going on. And I've chained this patch, much like FM operators, with some feedback involved. The negative DNA sign comes out to modulate the frequency of the positive DNA. The positive DNA sign comes out to modulate the scissor, which of course feeds the switching, and with phase and sync lock on, this feeds right back through those positive and negative DNA oscillators as well. Now the triangle from the negative DNA feeds the mix, allowing me to blend in and mix in another waveform. And it's definitely got a nice digital wavetable kind of vibe, but adding LFOs to modulate the sine waves coming through these DNA sections gives us some more nice fading, modulating notes, and it just kind of re-emphasizes this kind of Terminator vibe of angry harmonics going on. Here's a big kind of epic drone where I'm taking individual sine wave outs, which is the green and blue trace on the right hand data, and panning them hard left and right. The yellow trace on the right hand data there is the square from the scissor, so we can see the switching rate. And then I've got 6 free running LFOs, free to positive, free to negative DNA, to fade through the switching states to fully on, to fully off, with each of the waveforms that the DNA sections have. I've got another LFO to PWM, which is changing where that switching occurs, and I've got a slow LFO to the VCAs CV. So that's it for this video on the Recombination Engine OSC2 from Future Sound Systems. Check out other demos featuring Future Sound System modules linked below. Leave a comment, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, support my work on patreon.com/DivKid if you wish. Thank you if you do. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.